They call her La Jefa, which is Spanish for the boss. Not the boss's wife, not the woman standing behind the man, but the boss, in a world that does not hand that word to women and did not hand it to her either. She took it. Although she is past 60 now, a grandmother, she is still the single most important figure in the story of the most feared criminal El Mencho in the Western Hemisphere. Because when people talk about El Mencho, they talk about the man, the soldier who put a grenade into a military helicopter and watched it drop out of the sky, the face on the $10 million wanted poster, the name that crossed two countries like a curse for more than a decade. What they leave out is that the man didn't build any of it. Before the army and the bounty and the myth, he was a broke kid from Aguililla with a 5th grade education and a couple of deportations behind him, guarding fields that belonged to someone else. The name that opened doors, the bloodline that commanded respect, the money machine that turned his guns into an empire. All of it came to him through one woman, and he married her in a church in Michoacan in 1996. Her name is Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia. And here's the part that should stop you cold, because it rearranges everything that comes after it. When the trap finally closed, 30 years down the line, it was the man, the legend, the most wanted face in the hemisphere, who ended up dying on the floor of a military aircraft before it could even touch the ground. The woman, the sick one, the watched one, had already walked free a full year earlier and disappeared back into the same mountains her family has ruled for half a century. So the question this story answers isn't how a soldier turned into a myth. It's the harder one almost nobody says out loud. How does a woman take a broke plantation guard and build him into El Mencho, and then outlive the monster she made? To understand what happened, you have to start where she started, in a place most maps don't bother to name. She was born around 1963 in El Naranjo, a rural community inside the municipality of Aguililla in the Mexican state of Michoacan. No electricity, no paved roads, a hamlet in the region they call Tierra Caliente, so remote and so violent and so deeply stitched into the fabric of Mexican organized crime that the government would one day send the National Guard just to pave the roads. This is where she came into the world, and she was the eldest of the daughters in a family of at least 18 siblings, a clan so large that the people in their town gave them a nickname. They called them the Queenies, after a small ground squirrel native to Michoacan, an animal known for one specific trait. It gives birth to litters of more than a dozen young every single time. The name was a joke. Then it became a legend. The family started in the fields, avocados, hard labor under the sun. By the 1970s, they had moved to a more profitable crop, marijuana, then opium poppy, then cocaine, and eventually the synthetic poisons that would flood American cities decades later. In that same era, the family formed the Millennial Cartel, the group that would later splinter into the organization the world now knows as CJNG. Its early leader was Armando Valencia Cornelio, a man the underworld called El Maradona, named after the Argentine footballer for reasons the history books never quite pinned down, though one imagines it had something to do with an ability to move through defenders untouched. He built the early routes for cocaine and marijuana across the border, and he paid for it with years in Mexican and American prisons. By the time he came out, the empire had already outgrown him. The family did not slow down. They kept building. Their rise tracked the drug trade north. When her older siblings emigrated to California in the 1980s and moved into the business there, the money followed them home, and the poor clan from a hamlet with no electricity became something with reach on both sides of the border. At least 10 of her brothers and several of her sisters would end up tied to the trade, a bench of operators deep enough that no single loss could ever end it. Now here's the detail that reorders the entire story. Before Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was El Mencho. Before the bounty, before the helicopter, he worked for her family. He was a laborer, a guard on the Gonzalez Valencia marijuana plantations in Michoacan. A young man from the same poor region with the same 5th grade education and the same hunger, doing security for a clan that already had money, already had structure, already had a name. He had gone north as a teenager, been caught for drugs in California, been deported, crossed again, been caught again selling heroin, and been sent back for good. Along the way, he had even done a stretch inside a local Mexican police force, learning the machinery of the state from the inside before he spent the rest of his life at war with it. When he returned to Mexico for the last time, he had a soldier's instincts and almost nothing else. What he did not have was a bloodline. She did. They married in 1996. It was not a wedding. It was a merger. Two criminal organizations sealing a pact in a church. His capacity for violence, her family's 30 years of financial architecture. He had the men. She had the name that made the men mean something. When the Millennial Cartel fractured after 2010 and the structure her family had built collapsed under the weight of arrests and rivals, the faction that survived did not rebuild on violence alone. It rebuilt on the money machine her people had spent decades assembling. When the Millennial Cartel broke apart into rival factions, the family's side outfought the other and consolidated control. And after El Chapo Guzman was extradited to the United States in 2017, El Mencho rose into the empty space at the top and became the most wanted man in Mexico. What emerged were two organizations that functioned as opposite sides of the same coin. On one side, CJNG, his army, moving product, waging war, shooting police chiefs in broad daylight, bringing military aircraft out of the sky. On the other side, Los Queenies, her family's operation, the hotels and the salons and the shell companies and the real estate, a machine that took the money the soldiers generated and turned it into something a bank would accept. Her brother Abigail, known as El Queenie, was the public face of that machine. But Rosalinda was the bridge, the connection between the violence and the money, between the cartel and the legitimate world it hid inside. By 2015, the numbers had reached a scale that governments could not ignore. Authorities put the network at more than 70 CJNG-affiliated businesses. The United States Departments of Treasury, Justice, and State all identify Los Queenies as the financial backbone of the entire cartel, with operations confirmed across the United States, Latin America, Africa, Europe, and Asia. In a single 2-year window, she was accused of laundering more than 1 billion pesos, over 50 million American dollars. The businesses read like a legitimate portfolio. With ordinary people walking through their doors every day, none of them aware of whose money moved beneath the transactions. That was the design. The soldiers generated the cash, her network made it vanish into the ordinary economy. Then on February 28, 2015, her brother Abigail was arrested in Puerto Vallarta. Every intelligence assessment assumed the network would collapse with him. Instead, Rosalinda stepped into his chair before the news cycle finished. Los Queenies stopped existing as a separate entity and folded entirely into the cartel, held together now not by her brother but by her, and she did it while using the courts as a shield. Between April 2015 and February 2018, she and her daughter Jessica filed 6 separate legal injunctions to block their own arrests. All 6 were denied on the grounds that no warrant existed, and all the while, the network kept running under her hand. The courts could not stop what they refused to acknowledge. She was not trying to win. She was buying time. In April 2015, the United States sanctioned El Mencho, Abigail, and a web of cartel businesses under the Kingpin Act, and the arrests kept coming brother by brother across continents. Gerardo in Uruguay, Jose in Brazil, Elvis shot and taken from a hospital bed in Zapopan. Each captured proof that 2 governments were now hunting a single family across 2 hemispheres. In May 2018, the Navy took her outside a convenience store in an upscale Guadalajara neighborhood, in the shadow of one of the tallest luxury towers in the city where she had been living. She paid 1.5 million pesos in bail and walked out 3 months later. In February 2020, her daughter Jessica flew to Washington for a family court hearing, left her 2 children with Rosalinda, and was arrested at the courthouse door. In November 2021, the military took Rosalinda again, and this time there was no bail. By then, 4 of her brothers and 2 of her children were behind bars, and she was described as one of the last living links between CJNG and the financial network she had built. In December 2023, a judge finally sentenced her to 5 years, not for the empire, but for undisclosed transactions at a car wash she owned in Puerto Vallarta. She was sick by then. The disease attacking her kidneys was the same category of illness that was killing her husband in the mountains. By 2023, the reporting on her condition had turned grave. Hypertension, an undisclosed terminal illness, a body breaking down behind prison walls, and the state's own doctors conceded she was sick, but argued she was not dying fast enough to qualify for release under Mexican law. But in January 2025, a judge ordered her early release for good conduct, and on the night of February 27, 2025, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia walked out of a federal women's prison in Morelos, accompanied by her lawyer, required to check in every month. Watched, not free, not imprisoned, watched. 1 year later, a Mencho was dead, found in the mountains, wounded, loaded onto a military plane that he did not survive, and Rosalinda was still standing, Nobody could confirm where. Within weeks, her own son, a Valencia by blood, a United States citizen, was reported as the cartel's new leader. That is the skeleton of it. Now here's why it happened, and why it could only have happened to her. To answer how a woman made El Mencho powerful, you have to understand the one thing he could never manufacture, no matter how many men he commanded, and that thing was lineage. In the world they lived in, the guns are the cheap part. Anybody desperate enough can find a gun and a reason to use it. What can't be bought, what has to be inherited, is a name that criminal organizations already trust, and that was the inheritance Rosalinda was born holding. Her people had been in the business since before she could walk. The nickname the town gave them, the Queenies, was supposed to be a joke about how many of them there were. All those brothers and sisters spilling out of a poor family in a poor corner of Michoacan, like the litters of that little squirrel. But the joke aged into something closer to prophecy, because that same fertility of numbers became a fertility of reach. 18 siblings meant 18 sets of hands, 18 names to spread across cities and borders, 18 threads in a web that no single arrest could ever fully tear. They started poor, growing avocados on a plot of family land, and then in the 1970s, the fields quietly changed what they grew. First marijuana, then opium poppy trafficked north into the United States. And when the older siblings immigrated to California in the 1980s and plugged themselves into the drug trade there, the family's fortunes rose with them, until the poor clan from the hamlet with no electricity had become something with money, structure, and a name that meant something on both sides of the line. At the center of that ascent stood her uncle, Armando Valencia Cornelio, the man the underworld called El Maradona. He founded the Milenio Cartel in the era when the border was a river of cocaine and marijuana, and the men who controlled the crossings became kings of small mountain kingdoms. He built the roots. He built the relationships with the buyers on the other side. He built the reputation that made the Valencia name into currency in a business where reputation is the only collateral that matters. And when he was arrested in the early 2000s and buried under a sentence measured in decades, that name did not go to prison with him. It stayed in the family, in the blood, in the siblings who had grown up watching the trade transform their avocado fields into something far more lucrative than fruit. Even Rosalinda's own tangled history ran through him. By some accounts, he was not only her uncle, but, at one point, her husband, the father of a son who would matter enormously to this story much later. The family was that closely woven. The blood and the business were the same thing. This is the family Nemesio Oseguera walked into as hired help. Picture it clearly, because the picture is everything. A skinny, silent young man from Aguililla, a place so poor that leaving it illegally at 14 felt like the only sensible plan, standing guard over marijuana plants that belonged to people who already had everything he wanted. He had come back from the United States hardened. He had gone north as a boy and worked whatever came, fields, construction, anything. He had been arrested for drug possession around the age of 20 and deported. He had crossed again and been caught a second time selling heroin in California and deported again. Somewhere in those years, he even did a stretch inside a local police force back in Mexico, learning the machinery of the state from the inside before he spent his life at war with it. By every account, he was dangerous in a way that made even the people around him uneasy, something cold behind the eyes. But dangerous men are common in that country. Dangerous men without a family behind them end up as muscle, and muscle is disposable. He knew it. And the woman whose family owned the fields knew it too. What the family saw in him was not a partner, but a weapon, and weapons are worth the most to the people who own the armory. He needed them far more than they ever needed him, and the marriage was simply the price of admission to a name he could never have earned on his own. What she had that he lacked was the one currency the trade cannot print. The people who later studied his rise kept arriving at the same uncomfortable truth, that he reached the top of the cartel through a strategy of diplomacy by marriage. He had been a chief of hitmen, a commander of violence, genuinely feared, running guns and killing for the bosses above him, but he did not have the lineage. She did. He had the soldiers. She had the bloodline. And in 1996, when they stood together in that church in Michoacan, those two things fused into something neither could have become alone. The wedding sealed a pact between the family that knew how to make money invisible and the man who knew how to make problems disappear. And from that fusion came one of the most powerful criminal empires in the history of North America. You can trace the leverage in the smallest details of how the organization grew. When the Milenio Cartel splintered in the 2000s, after the arrests of its senior figures, it broke into rival factions. Los Torcidos on one side, La Resistencia on the other. And the faction that won, Los Torcidos, The one led by El Mencho and several of his wife's relatives did not win only because it was more violent. It won because it could absorb the loyalty of the old millennial men, and those men followed because of who Rosalinda was. Through her, the niece of the cartel's founder, the new organization inherited a whole generation of veterans, contacts, and trust that a former plantation guard could never have assembled on his own. Some of those very men would go on to form Los Quines, the financial fraction that became the cartel's beating heart. He was the sword. Her name was the reason so many hands were willing to pick that sword up and swing it for him. And when El Chapo Guzman was finally extradited to the United States in 2017, and the biggest name in the Mexican underworld disappeared behind American bars, it was El Mencho who rose into the vacuum and became the most wanted man in the country, standing, though few said it aloud, on a platform his wife's family had built. The bloodline did not stop at loyalty. It reached into the machinery of the family itself. The men handled the war. The women handled the wealth. It was never only Rosalinda, her sisters-in-law, the wives of her brothers, a whole tier of women moving through the legitimate economy with a fluency the soldiers never had, all of them suspected of heading businesses and washing money for the same enterprise. One by one, over the years, the sanctions and the suspicion spread outward through the family like a stain, and the household kept absorbing the losses because the household was enormous. That was the whole advantage of a family of 18. You could arrest a face and the body kept moving because there was always another name ready to take up the same thread. This was not a man building an organization and slotting a wife into it. This was a family absorbing a useful, dangerous outsider and pointing him at their enemies. The empire had her fingerprints on it from the foundation up, because the foundation was hers to begin with. And the way it all ends tells you exactly where the real power lived the whole time. When you follow the family tree to its final branch, you arrive at a man named Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez. And he is not El Mencho's son at all. He is Rosalinda's son from her relationship with the old millennial founder, her uncle and one-time husband, a stepson to El Mencho, a Valencia by blood. And it is that man, the one carrying her family's name rather than her husband's, whom reporting would later identify as the new head of the cartel once El Mencho was gone. The throne did not pass down El Mencho's line. It passed back into hers, the way water finds the lower ground, because it was always, underneath everything, her family's empire, wearing his reputation like a borrowed coat. And that is not a small irony. It is the whole architecture of the thing laid bare. For 30 years, the world looked at El Mencho and saw the source of the power, when the truth was that he was the instrument of it. The name was hers. The money was hers. The loyalty of the old guard was hers. He was the face they put on it, because a face like his kept the guns pointed outward and the world's attention fixed on the violence rather than the vault. When he died, the coat came off, and underneath was exactly what had always been there. That is the first component of the answer. He was powerful because she made him legitimate in a world where legitimacy is inherited, not earned. But legitimacy alone does not survive a decade of two governments hunting you. Surviving that took something else entirely. A machine so quiet and so ordinary that armies could not find it, and building that machine was the second thing she did. Here is what governments can touch. They can touch the visible things. The helicopter falling out of the sky, the police chief shot dead on the avenue, the roadblocks burning across Guadalajara, the soldiers and the guns and the bodies in the road. Visible things trigger visible responses. Armies get deployed, bounties get raised, arrests get made, press conferences get held. The state is built to answer violence with violence, and on that battlefield El Mencho gave as good as any warlord in the hemisphere. What the state struggles to touch is the money, and the reason is almost beautiful in its simplicity. The money doesn't look like a cartel. The money looks like a hotel in Puerto Vallarta where tourists drink cocktails by the pool without a single thought in their heads. It looks like a beauty salon in Guadalajara where a woman gets her hair done on a Wednesday afternoon. It looks like a bottle of tequila on a restaurant shelf, a plate of sushi at a corner table, a resort with rental cabanas, a car wash on a quiet side street handling transactions so ordinary that nobody on earth would look at them twice. That was Rosalinda's genius. And it was a genius of a completely different order than her husband's. While he commanded soldiers and shot down aircraft and kept the DEA chasing his shadow across 2 continents, she was building the thing that made all of it possible. Not with weapons, but with paperwork. Business licenses, shell companies, real estate deeds, a web of legitimate commerce so deeply embedded in the Mexican economy that 2 governments would spend years just trying to untangle a single thread of it. A spread wide enough to launder anything and diverse enough that no single seizure could cripple it. These were not grubby fronts hidden in back alleys with the lights off, Ordinary people walked into these places every single day. Dirty money screams. Rosalinda's money whispered, and it whispered in the language of ordinary Mexican life so fluently that the country's own commerce swallowed it whole. Think about what that actually requires, not just owning a hotel, but running it. Real guests, real payroll, real tax filings, so the books could absorb a river of narco cash and still read like the honest ledger of a busy business. Every salon needed real stylists. Every restaurant needed real diners. The laundering worked precisely because the businesses were, on their surface, entirely real, generating just enough legitimate activity to bury the illegitimate money inside them. It is one thing to hide a dollar. It is another to build an entire visible economy whose only secret purpose is to swallow dollars whole. By 2015, authorities believe she oversaw more than 70 businesses. In one 2-year window, she was accused of laundering more than 1 billion pesos, over 50 million American dollars, cleaned and cycled and made spendable through this constellation of ordinary storefronts. And she kept it in the family down to the ledgers. Some of the businesses were registered in her own children's names. Court records would later show that El Mencho himself directed their daughter Jessica to manage one of the resorts and to keep the cartel's accounting books, that he sat with her at a ranch going line by line over discrepancies, over money the organization was owed. The most feared man in the hemisphere, doing his bookkeeping like a nervous small business owner going over receipts, because the woman who normally ran that side of things had drilled it into the whole family that the numbers were sacred, that the numbers were the difference between a fortune that lasts and a fortune that gets you killed. And the reach of it was genuinely global. This was not a regional operation quietly washing pesos in one Mexican state. Investigators traced the network's dealings into the United States, across Latin America, into Africa, into Europe, into Asia. A financial bloc that 3 separate branches of the United States government would name as the monetary backbone of one of the most violent criminal organizations on earth. Then came the test that should have ended everything. On February 28, 2015, her brother Abigail, El Queenie, the public face of the entire financial operation, the figurehead the government had been hunting for years, was arrested in Puerto Vallarta. The state announced it as a decapitation strike against CJ&G's money. Every analyst assumed the network would come apart without him. It was the moment the machine was supposed to break. It did not break because the machine was never really his. Rosalinda stepped into his chair before the announcement had finished circulating through the newsrooms. Los Queenies, which had run for years as a sister organization operating alongside the cartel, stopped existing as a separate thing and folded completely into CJ&G. And the person holding that seam together, the single point of continuity between the violence and the wealth, was her. Where her brother's arrest should have left a crater, it left almost nothing, because she simply absorbed his role overnight and kept the money moving as if nothing had happened at all. And she did it while turning the legal system itself into a weapon aimed back at the state. The pressure had begun on April 8, 2015, when the United States Treasury sanctioned El Mencho, Abigail, and a constellation of cartel-linked businesses under the Kingpin Act. And on that exact same day, Rosalinda filed the first of what would become 6 writs of amparo, preemptive legal applications designed to block her own arrest before it could ever happen, each one arguing that authorities were targeting the family without cause. Over the next 3 years, from April 2015 to February 2018, she and her daughter filed and filed and filed. Everyone was denied. The courts kept ruling there were no active warrants against them. But winning was never the point. Each filing bought weeks. Each appeal bought months. She ran the network while the lawyers worked, and she worked the courts while the network ran, and she stretched that arrangement out for 3 full years before the state could finally lay hands on her. It was chess, and she was playing it against 2 federal governments at the same time, sacrificing pawns to keep the queen on the board. When they did finally convict her, the machine had one last lesson to teach about how far intent runs ahead of proof. In 2023, a Mexican federal judge looked at everything the prosecutors had assembled and said on the record that he was convinced she had received illegal cartel funds, convinced she used them to buy and liquidate assets on the organization's behalf, convinced the proceeds had moved into private cartel bank accounts she managed, convinced the whole enormous picture was real. And then he sentenced her to 5 years for a car wash. Not the hotels, not the shopping malls, not the tequila brand or the resort or the $50 million across 4 continents. A single car wash in Puerto Vallarta for failing to disclose its transactions. The judge believed all of it. A car wash was the most he could prove. That gap between what everyone knew and what anyone could establish in a courtroom was not an accident, and in a country where a cartel has spent decades buying judges and police commanders and politicians at every level of government, that gap has a particular texture to it. The real question was never whether the system failed to convict her of what she'd actually done. The question is whether a system like that was ever built to reach a woman like her at all. She had spent a lifetime making the money look like anything but what it was, and in the end, the state could only lay a finger on the one piece too small and too clumsy to matter. The empire stayed invisible even in her conviction. That was the second thing she gave her husband, not just legitimacy, but invisibility. And for a decade, invisibility is exactly what kept him alive. Which brings us to the cruelest part of the whole story, the part that turns the title from a claim into a fact. Because if Rosalinda was the thing that made El Mencho untouchable, the bloodline that made him legitimate, the machine that made him invisible, then the obvious question is, what happens to a man like that when the woman is finally taken away? The answer to that question is a body on the floor of a military aircraft, and the road to it was paved, name by name. Over the 10 years the state spent dismantling everything she had built around him. Watch it fall. In January 2016, her brother Gerardo was arrested in Uruguay, a whole ocean away, having fled Mexico entirely months earlier. Proof, if anyone needed it, that two governments were now coordinating across continents to erase a single family. The same month, her brother Elvis was shot several times in Zapopan, rushed to a hospital, checked in under a false name, and recognized in his own hospital bed by federal agents who arrested him before he could even heal. Two brothers, 1 month, different hemispheres. In December 2017, her brother Jose was taken in Brazil, run down despite a fake Mexican passport, a fabricated Bolivian identity card, and an alias, Jefa, that Interpol had never once logged. Interpol couldn't find him because his false name wasn't on any watch list. Brazilian authorities cracked it anyway. 2 continents, 5 brothers falling in 3 years, and through all of it, she kept filing her injunctions, and she kept the money moving, and she held the seam together with her bare hands while the people who had built the empire beside her disappeared into prisons on 2 hemispheres. Then the walls reached her own household. On the evening of May 26, 2018, in an upscale neighborhood of Zapopan, the kind of address where narco money goes to look respectable, a woman was approached outside a 7-Eleven by personnel from the Mexican Navy. They asked for her name. She confirmed it. Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, La Jefa, arrested on money laundering and organized crime charges, standing on a sidewalk in the shadow of one of the tallest luxury residential towers in Guadalajara, where she had been living. Not a shot was fired. She paid $1.5 million pesos and walked out 3 months later. The charges ruled insufficient, the evidence inadequate, free again. But the circle was tightening, and she knew it. In February 2020, her daughter Jessica boarded a flight to Washington to attend the court hearing of her brother. And before she left Guadalajara, she did what mothers do. She left her 2 young children with someone she trusted absolutely. She left them with Rosalinda. Then Jessica walked into a federal courthouse and was arrested at the door, having been under surveillance the entire journey, and was later sentenced to 30 months in an American prison for doing financial business with cartel-designated companies. A resort, an advertising agency, a sushi restaurant, a tequila brand. So now the grandmother was raising her daughter's children in cartel territory, watching a sentencing she could not attend from the wrong side of a border she could not cross. And on November 15th, 2021, the military came for Rosalinda one final time. They took her in Zapopan, and the Ministry of Defense called it a significant blow to the financial structure of organized crime in the state. Words they had used before, but meant more this time because by now 4 of her brothers and 2 of her children were already incarcerated, and she was described in intelligence assessments as one of the very last functioning links between the cartel and the financial network she had spent her life building. She was the last one holding the seam together. This time, there was no bail. This time, the architect was gone. The architect was gone. After Rosalinda was taken, El Mencho was a sick man moving through the mountains of Jalisco, his kidneys failing, his dialysis schedule tracked by the intelligence agencies hunting him, and his trusted circle shrinking with every arrest. He had always been the soldier. She had been the mind keeping him safe. With her gone, he brought someone new close. Her name was Guadalupe Moreno Carrillo. Their relationship reportedly began after Rosalinda's arrest. She first surfaced publicly in October 2022 through the Guacamaya leaks, which exposed the cartel's organizational chart and listed her among regional coordinators and plaza chiefs. El Mencho had replaced the woman who understood the danger of trust with someone the state could see and monitor. That decision would cost him everything. Meanwhile, Rosalinda suffered from an autoimmune disease attacking her kidneys, while El Mencho's kidneys were failing in the mountains. Mexican medical experts acknowledged her illness but ruled it wasn't terminal under Mexican law. In January 2025, a judge ordered her released early for good conduct after serving more than half her sentence. Prosecutors appealed, but a higher court upheld the decision. On February 27th, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia walked out of prison in Morelos, required to check in monthly. The collapse continued immediately. That same night, her brother-in-law Antonio Oseguera was extradited to the United States. The next day, El Mencho's older brother Abraham was recaptured. Their complicated debt stretched back to 1992, when El Mencho had taken prison time, so Abraham, already twice convicted, could avoid a life sentence. Abraham served 10 years anyway. In March 2025, her son El Menchito received life plus 30 years and was ordered to forfeit $6 billion. By summer, her brother Abigail, who had fought extradition for a decade after his 2015 arrest, was finally sent north. Her family was disappearing through arrests and extraditions while Rosalinda remained free. Then, in February 2026, military intelligence located an associate of Guadalupe Moreno Carrillo. The associate drove her to a mountain town south of Guadalajara to meet El Mencho. An army drone confirmed his location on February 21st. Before sunrise the next day, special forces surrounded the area. A firefight erupted. El Mencho was wounded, fled into the forest, was found in the undergrowth, taken into custody, and died aboard a military aircraft before it could land. Mexico's defense secretary confirmed the operation had been triggered by surveillance of a romantic partner and her associate. The woman El Mencho trusted after Rosalinda was taken had ultimately led authorities to him. After his death, no one could confirm where Rosalinda was. No arrest, no manhunt, no statement. The cartel throne then passed back to her bloodline. Her son from her first marriage, carrying the Valencia name, was reported and later confirmed as the cartel's new leader. And that is the symmetry of the story. Rosalinda was the mind behind El Mencho's power. When she was taken away, he lost the person who kept his world controlled. He replaced her with someone who could be watched, and that relationship ultimately exposed him. Most of the men around her are now in prison or dead. El Mencho became a legend, only to be found through the woman he turned to after Rosalinda disappeared. And Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, sick, past 60, her kidneys failing like his, is still free, somewhere in those mountains while her son sits where her husband once sat. She made El Mencho powerful, she outlived him, and nobody knows where she is.